Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you are joining us. My name is Dr. Natasha Falahi, the Sensitive Doctor, and I am very excited to introduce our special guest today, Mark Tanaka. Mark is a teacher and coach that specializes in helping people with nervous system regulation and childhood attachment trauma, as well as somatic attachment, developmental trauma repair, and inner child work. He has a unique background of 25 years in Eastern self-healing and self-regulation practices such as yoga, qigong, meditation, and Buddhist practices, as well as training in progressive Western body-based psychology approaches. Mark, it is a great pleasure to have you joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I'd love to kind of hear about your story and how you got into doing all the work you do and how you really blended that Eastern and Western approach.
Sure. So basically, a lot of my journey started when I was in college at UC Santa Cruz. I got into meditation, yoga, qigong, and there was a holistic health program there. So I started studying massage, herbology, and acupressure. And alongside of that, I was also starting to experiment with psychedelics and non-ordinary states of consciousness. And I was beginning to have a lot of experiences with what we might call energy or subtle energy. I got really fascinated with that. I also, being at UC Santa Cruz, being in college, you learn a lot about social justice and what's going on in the world. I was very concerned about the state of our planet and what was happening in our society. So naturally, I was thinking about how do we make the world a better place, right? Simply put. And naturally, because I was so fascinated and studying these types of practices, I was looking at the application of these practices for social change. And that's actually what became my major. And particularly, I was interested in how can we take these Eastern practices, and because I was having all these transformational experiences with it, one primary experience, for example, that was really influential for me was having this dissolution experience or oneness experience where I felt connected to everything. And I felt my sense of self dissolve, right? And I woke up to a deep sense of compassion or care for everyone and everything. And also another thing that I was experiencing was a lot of release of stored trauma in my body. So I started to understand that a lot of these practices were, and I didn't have the languaging at the time, but were phenomenal for trauma release and healing, nervous system regulation, and also for helping us enter into non-ordinary states of consciousness that would be very supportive for our well-being, our mental health, and also potentially for social change.
Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds really cool. And I think a lot of our listeners and viewers today can really resonate with this idea. I mean, whether it's using things like psychedelics or whatever to have these spiritual or energetic experiences. But a lot of times people who are empaths and sensitive are experiencing the world and the, energies around them since they were children. And, and they're not quite sure what they're experiencing because it's just the way they have always experienced life. So I think that idea of really feeling the world around you or feeling connected, that oneness, is something that we can really resonate with and understand what that is. But often there becomes this overwhelm. And, we talked about overwhelm a lot in terms of when the system gets overwhelmed, when the nervous system gets overwhelmed, the body gets overwhelmed, we start storing that, right? We store that in tissue in our body. And those are all versions of trauma, right? Whether it's little t trauma, big T trauma. And the reason I'm so excited to dive into this with you is because of your expertise in the body-based releases of that as well. And my background is chiropractic and energy work and all of that. And so I had similar experiences where I started releasing trauma through hands-on or energy medicine or those sort of things. And a lot of times, experts are talking about a lot of mindset things we can do or, gratitude and all that stuff is amazing. But I love bringing into the conversation how our bodies can help us through that process. So tell us a little bit more about that, like kind of the somatic experience of when, why we store trauma in our bodies and how we can use that for healing as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I love mindset work. I'm actually getting more into that these days because I think it's very important to train the mind in that way. But often in the process, what is missed is all the memory that's stored in the body. I really look at the body as the repository, right? The storehouse. So everything that's happened to us in the past, the body accumulates and stores. And then what the body mind does is repeat the cycle of that, right? Particularly what's important, I think, is what happens in early childhood and development. So over time, doing this work, because I've spent a majority of my years over the last 25 years teaching yoga, qigong, and meditation. And over the last 10 years, I've really pivoted to doing the attachment and developmental work. Because what I found was over time with my long-term students, as we go deeper, usually when you get to the core of what's getting people blocked and the root of that, it goes back to childhood and the patterns that were set into motion in the childhood experience, right? And particularly in relationship, in the dynamic with their primary caregivers, aka, usually mom and dad, but it could be uncles or grandpas, right? Whoever was around, and that was their primary attachment. And so when those patterns get set into motion, it's not just a mental thing, but it's a very deeply ingrained nervous system and neurophysiological emotional pattern. It predisposes how we feel about ourselves, right? Deep in the body. It impacts how we perceive other people, and it also influences how we see and feel the world around us as well. And that's all stored in the body. And often we look at the mind and the thinking process because, we're such a mental culture, we're often paying attention to that, but we don't realize how a lot of the thought process actually emerge out of a state, which is in the body.
That's fascinating. And for people who are kind of new to this concept, tell us a little bit about what is attachment theory and what is attachment trauma? Can you break that down for people who've never heard about this idea of attachment?
Absolutely. The way that I like to talk about it and think about it is maybe a little different from how it might be conveyed in conventional attachment psychotherapy literature, because I'm going more based on my own experience. The way I look at human beings is that we are all very much connection and relational beings, right? And so our neurophysiology, our development, everything is rooted in relationship and connecting. So one of the things I like to talk about is how a human child is not able to survive on their own when they're popping out of the womb. They really need the parents. So immediately right after they're out of the womb, the child, as soon as they open their eyes, they're looking for facial expressions and they're looking at the face of their caregivers around them and they're trying to input and connect. That they're trying to take the information in and actually connect with them. So because survival is so dependent on the adults, on the parents, the child has a deep impulse for connection. And not only the basic survival needs, but the development of the child is dependent on the parents as well. So how we develop our nervous system, how we learn how to cope with stress, right? And so when that reaching out and connection impulse in the child is unmet for whatever reason, or not tended to properly, that can create a lot of distress actually and trauma in the child. And so this process goes on all the way through our development, through childhood, even the teens, right? And the trauma or the disconnection or the missing of the meeting of the primary need. So the needs are there for a reason, right? They're not just trivial things. We have these needs because for us to develop into a full mature human being, we need certain kinds of input. We need certain kinds of support. And so when those things are missing, or when we feel a lot of disconnect in those places, it's almost like we're missing the necessary ingredient, nutrient, or template to develop into a full, complete human being.
So yeah, we talk about this happening in childhood, but then how does this continue to impact a person's nervous system and their behavior when they become an adult?
Right, perfect. So let me just give you actually a more concrete example, because I think examples might be more helpful. And this is something I've seen a lot with my sensitive clients. And I'm a sensitive myself and an empath myself, and we tend to attract each other, right? So my practice tends to be full of those people. And one of the most common narratives and patterns I've seen, for example, with sensitive types and empaths, is that we were in an early childhood environment where our parents were either because they were overwhelmed themselves or dysregulated, stressed themselves. They weren't really good at consistently tuning into our system and knowing how to take care of us. And instead, we had to often pay attention to the dysregulation out here and try to create calm or help what was out here, right?
Yeah.
So in that process, a couple of things happen. One, our system gets trained to not feel distress, have it met and regulated. What does that do? That keeps us in a state of distress perpetually. We always feel uneasy. We constantly feel uncomfortable. And then to try to solve that, we, instead of getting it here, right, receiving it, we try to go out and fix or help the people around us to indirectly get that regulation. So, for example, the parent is dysregulated. The child's like, I can't get regulated if the parent is dysregulated. So I'm going to go try to help them. And so we become very externally focused and oriented in our consciousness. And we have a very hard time paying attention to what's happening in our own bodies and also finding regulation there. So we either numb it out or we dislocate our attention and try to manage things out here as a way to cope.
Wow, that's a fascinating way of explaining it, because I think a lot of empaths, highly sensitive people, they already identify with that behavior, that pattern of them, trying to help others, caretake, be peacemakers,
Right.
but they don't necessarily always think about, oh, that was rooted in something that was actually survival based and adaptive, and it was actually helping us at one point. But when those things, those patterns stay in our system, even past the point where they're actually helpful or adaptive for us, that's when we start to get into this kind of trauma patterning, right? And
Right.
I think it is so fascinating to try to go back into the body to help people reconnect with themselves and those disconnects that they had. So in your approach and the way that you look at this stuff, how do you address these deep-seated patterns in the nervous system?
I like to take a kind of a multi-pronged approach. So one, I think it's helpful for anyone in general, but especially for sensitives, to have some sort of meditation or self-awareness practice, or self-reflection practice, where you're training your awareness to become more aware of your own system and learning how to stay with your system. So traditionally in meditation, we might call it concentration practice. But this process of taking your attention and actually being present with yourself consistently over time and be able to maintain that continuity of attentiveness allows you to both become more self-aware of your state and leads to the foundation of being able to also self-regulate from there. And then from there, having some sort of body practice, like a yoga practice or breathing practice or qigong practice or tapping practice, like EFT, which gives you some tool to be able to start to build a relationship to your nervous system and begin to help you train how to up or down regulate your system. Over time, when you build that skill, you get really good at it. It's something that takes time. And then with the more deep-seated stuff, you need to, it's almost like surgery, you need to have like more technical skills. So you have to begin to identify exactly when those triggers are activated, how they show up in the body. And one of my favorite things to do is actually implement elements of what we call parts work, or IFS, internal family systems work, with a somatic focus. So what that looks like is that when that trigger comes up, you go into more of an observer state, right? And this is another thing you can cultivate through meditation practice, right? Go into your witness. And then you find a sensation in the body as a trigger, and you start to build a relationship to it. And as you become more aware of it and you learn how to actually talk to it, you can say, hi, how's it going? I feel that you're stressed or nervous. What's going on? How can I help? Right? And we can actually start to dialogue with our parts, right? In a sense. And we can start to learn by learning how to listen to the body, talking to these parts of us. We can start to glean some information on how to actually meet these places in our system to help them regulate. Now, this is sometimes difficult to do just by yourself. So often it's helpful to have a therapist or a healer or a coach there with you so they can kind of see from the outside, and from, because they're more experienced, they can point to you what's going on and exactly maybe coach you how to be with it. Again, like I said earlier, when that template is not there because the early parents didn't do it for you, we often won't know how to be with that part of us. And that's where the problem lies, right? We get dysregulated and we kind of just don't know what to do with ourselves. So we go into a coping behavior to try to manage it.
Yeah. And, as you were describing that, I was thinking too that there, I do hear a lot of objections sometimes from empaths or sensitive people because they have a really hard time getting still. They have a really hard time meditating and really tuning into themselves. And, just practicing at it is one way of getting better at it. But do you have any really helpful tips that are specific for empaths or sensitive people who have a harder time connecting with themselves?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really common. I've seen the same thing too in my practice. And so different, again, everyone's really different. So even within the context of empaths and sensitives, you're going to have a pretty wide range of types. So I really like to work with individuals and get to know them and experiment with them to find what's right for them. But that being said, for a lot of people who have a hard time being present in their body, partially it's because there's a lot of dysregulation and discomfort in the body. So first of all, it's helpful to do some, again, exercise, yoga, meditation to de-stress the body and release some tension. Even something I like to do is just shaking. Like if you spend 5 minutes just shaking and stretching a little bit, right, before you meditate and release some of that tension, you might actually have an easier time sitting. Right? So that's one thing. The second thing is actually to do it slowly and gradually and allow your awareness to move away from the body. So for example, and we could do this maybe at the end, I'll show you guys more in detail, but as you're sitting, when you meditate, often people say focus on your breath or focus on your body. But sometimes if you just go directly to your body and your body feels like hell, it's going to be really hard, right? Especially if you're a beginning meditator. So instead, doing meditations like looking towards the horizon and taking in your environment and actually extending your consciousness outward more and starting there in the environment and your five senses, right? And getting comfortable there first, right? And then gradually coming to the body in increments of time. So in methods like somatic experiencing, which is a trauma healing method, they talk about titration. So what that means is you spend a little bit of time. If it gets too much, you go back out. And then when you get more calm again, you come back in and you gradually build your tolerance.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think that you touch on a really important point there about how people do feel terrible in their own bodies because they've been carrying so much stress, so much weight, so much trauma for so many years.
Right.
And even just those first steps of getting back in touch with their body or back in touch with their pain, even on a physical level, is sometimes unbearable or scary that that people don't take the first steps. And I'd love for you to just give us some more insights about the body and the way that the body is processing the things that the stressors of our daily life or the stressors from our, childhood, or how that really shows up in the body and that body-based work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, depending on when and where the trauma happened and what was missed, the dysregulation patterns and the body patterns really vary. But let me see. Let's talk about different types of patterns of dysregulation or coping. Because part of what's going on is not only that it was their trauma, but we developed a way to manage or cope with the trauma. And often what we're working with is the coping mechanism. Okay. So for example, really early childhood trauma. This is like pre-birth to right after postnatal. This is another common pattern you see in people who were prematurely born. They got taken away usually from their parents right after they were born. So they didn't get that human contact or connection with their mother immediately that they primarily know they should have gotten. So their nervous system got very upregulated and then couldn't find regulation, right? Couldn't find calm again. And they were in intense distress. So as a result, one of the things the body does through intelligence to cope with it is actually dissociate or clench, right? One or both. So you'll see these patterns when you're sitting with someone and you start to talk about their attachment history or what's difficult in their current lives. One of the things I'm doing is tracking or watching their nervous system and their body response. And being an empath, I can pick up on the spikes in their nervous system and where their body language changes. I can feel it in my body, right? So then I'll notice that point of distress. I'll usually pause them and we'll start to examine what's actually arising in the body. And based on my experience, I often know what that dysregulation or coping pattern is. So then I'll point it out and have them become aware of it. So that's the first step, is actually recognizing the coping patterns, dysregulation patterns that are emerging in the body and beginning to develop an awareness around it. And because a lot of these dysregulations, as I said, are happening because something based on the need for connection wasn't met, we try to discover what was necessary there, what was missing. And we try to bring that experience to that person in that moment on the body level, so they can feel it, right? So even when across Zoom, I'll be talking with a client and I'll ask them, hey, can you feel that I'm here with you and that I'm attentive to you? and that I'm actually observing your inner experience quite accurately. And someone will be like, wow, yeah, I can. And as soon as they can register that there's someone is there that cares and it's safe, the body will actually respond to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, I love that example that you talk about, because these are things that maybe we see the effects of, but we don't really think about the roots of them. And, clenching being one. And I'd love to hear some more examples, because I know even in my practice and seeing people, there's definitely stuff that's associated with people who slouch a lot, people who kind of curl inward, people who, fidget a lot, things like that. And I'd love to hear, your experience of other examples of what you notice in people's body when this sort of stuff is dysregulated in them.
Right. So just going back to the sensitivity empath pattern I was talking about earlier, with the dislocation of awareness outward and the personal feelings and need being kind of neglected, right, in the relational dynamic with their parents, there's often a numbing out here and a disconnecting in the core. So with those people, it's very difficult to actually feel or be in touch with your own feelings and needs, right? There's a disconnect there and a numbness there. So when I start to work with those people, it actually takes a while to get them to allow me to be still. So you'll see different types of coping mechanisms or avoidance mechanisms. People will talk a lot, right? They'll get really chatty, or they'll get really cerebral about it, right? And so when you notice that pattern, again, if you understand it's a coping mechanism, you can gently and compassionately point it out to them and have them notice it, and then invite them, again, titration. So gradually invite them to be more aware of their body. And usually it's important to understand that they won't be able to do it in prolonged amounts of time at first. So you have to build that muscle gradually. And as we bring the right quality of awareness too, because sometimes we'll be judgmental or shaming ourselves. And in that case, I'll have them notice me and the kind of awareness I'm bringing to them. And I'll hold more of a spacious or relaxed, compassionate state. And so this is where the co-regulation is happening, right? And as a practitioner, I'm starting to bring, and you can do this also with peers too. You can train people to do this for each other, for partners. But we're starting to do some co-regulation work where I'll bring my nervous system down, get really steady and calm, right? Might change my tone of voice, smile or soften my body, right? Pause a little bit and create a sense of space, right? There's so many little things we can do with our voice, our body language, and our energy and our nervous system if we can modulate it to help other people, right?
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was going to ask you, I mean, there's a lot we're talking about when somebody's dealing with this in themselves or they're aware of it themselves. But I think another thing that is really common among empaths is that they're in families or in relationships in which, they're working on their own stuff, but they're also witnessing or being impacted by those around them. And so, sometimes we sit there and we talk a lot about like, oh, you can do this and this and this for yourself. But what you're starting to describe too are ways of kind of co-regulating the environment around you. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that to really empower empaths. I mean, not in a way where they just jump in and try to fix other people's attachment traumas or things like that, but how they can, create a life or a space or relationships that aren't just them working on themselves intensely in therapy and then living with people who may not be empaths, but also have stuff going on.
Right. That's like the big, tough question, right? I encounter that a lot too. It's a really challenging one. And my solution or advice or what I would recommend for people around that is, it sounds like in cliche, but to focus on your own healing first, first and foremost. Because, for example, a lot of people have anxious attachment patterns. And when I say that, I mean that they fear losing the connection they have if they become more centered in a healthy way in themselves, right? Because their early development in some way, shape, or form taught them that being self-focused, being in touch with your feelings and needs and asserting that gives you a negative response or makes you not met or gets you hurt or people withdraw or leave. So there's a lot of terror around actually being self-focused in a healthy way. So when that's the case, they're often finding themselves in a relationship that replays that pattern, right? Not because God's trying to teach them a lesson, not because they're bad, just because of habit and conditioning. So this is where I think it is important to have some therapeutic container, like a therapist's office or a group of people you work with who understand this and are supporting each other, like a support group or a school that you can go to that can start to give you a different template of possibility in a relationship where it can be safe to be around other people and bodies, right? And this has to be a gradual process because there's going to be a lot of trepidation and fear there. But we have to gradually condition the nervous system in the body to know that it's okay to be self-focused and to be in one's feelings and needs. And in that process the fear and shame that might be there. And once we start to know that it's okay and that we can be met, our self-identity and our self-image actually changes quite a bit. Because a lot of what we call insecurity or low self-confidence or low self-esteem is how we feel about ourselves. And the key word is feel, meaning what's programmed in our nervous system and our body. So, and a lot of that actually comes from not being met, and a sense of wrongness and rejection we felt from not being met gets deeply ingrained in the body. And then we think it's about us, right? Yeah. So when we can contradict that experience by actually allowing that person to be consistently met and have these sort of healing or therapeutic experiences, which needs to happen over time, over and over, but there's a gradual reconditioning that happens. And then once we feel more secure, because what that does is, again, secure, insecure, right? When the felt sense feeling in the body feels like, oh, I can be met, I can be myself, right? I can be loved, and connection and love is abundant, we develop an inner sense of security. Okay? And that becomes really the foundation that changes how we orient in relationship. So once we feel more secure that we can maintain a sense of feeling connected and okay, we can then go into these other relationships and set healthier boundaries, or feel okay drawing our energy back and not taking on everything that the other person's going through, or feel like we have to manage it. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so
definitely.
So this is a less strategy-based approach and more what we call a bottoms-up based approach of reprogramming the deeper imprint in the body, which changes the behavior.
Yeah, I think it's, at least when you're describing it, sounds like the very common concept of the idea of filling your cup first and filling your cup so it overflows. Because I think a lot of times empaths, as soon as they start to learn about their own trauma or ways to heal, rather than continuing to do that work for themselves, they're like, oh, I want to take this tool out and use it for my loved ones or to help other people heal. Right. But this idea of filling your cup first, focusing on your healing, and then the things resonate and start changing around you. The way you relate to those relationships change.
Absolutely. I did that for 15 years after I even started learning this stuff. So I completely relate with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you brought up some of this vocabulary around attachment too. You talked about an anxious attachment. And then, I know that there's like avoidant attachment and secure attachment. So for people who haven't heard these terms before, can you just break down what generally those types of attachment styles look like?
Yeah. So the two main categories are what we call secure and insecure attachment. And attachment styles and attachment trauma, again, ties into developmental trauma. So when we didn't, again, like I said earlier, get the connection needs consistently and stably, to know that our relationship and our connection to our primary caregivers and our environment is stable and secure, we develop an internalized felt sense of insecurity. And that turns into various forms of behavior, right? The insecurity manifests as different form of behavior. So with the anxious type, the way they cope with that or manage that in their system is they get anxious, so they pursue people, right? They overcommit themselves. They act extra nice because they feel like they need to be extra hypervigilant and focused and managing to maintain the connection, because it's something that they feel like is slipping out of their hands, right? And an avoidant type feels so hurt and traumatized that they're like, this is not worth it. I'm just going to completely withdraw, right? So it's almost more based on a sense of deep hopelessness, I think. That's been my experience, that when something feels untenable or difficult comes up, the way you cope with it is by pulling away. And in general, you're more protected in your coping mechanism, and your tendency is to withdraw from connection when something gets difficult, right? And then you have something called disorganized attachment. And this is either when the parent you were dealing with was really displaying a lot of emotion or affect of aversion or anger. So it was really unsafe or uncomfortable being around them, or you felt judged a lot, or they were physically maybe even violent. So there's a lack of safety associated with connection. The system gets confused, right? So it both needs connection, but it's also afraid of it. So I call it the gas pedal and the brake syndrome, where you're like pushing on the gas and brake at the same time and you kind of get stuck. And once in a while you get anxious, and once in a while you just want to go away and you can't decide which one to do. And so we call it disorganized. Right?
So I know that some people, when they hear this idea, because a lot of it develops in childhood, right? And they're just like, okay, well, you've developed an anxious attachment or an avoidant or a disorganized attachment. That all in and of itself feels a little bit overwhelming or hopeless for them. Is it possible for people who identify with these types of attachment styles, these insecure attachment styles, to actually get to a place where they have a secure attachment style, because they can't go back and redo their childhood or their relationship to their parents? But
yeah, absolutely, I do think it is possible. And maybe not everyone, right? Because there's, again, with everything there's severity and degrees, and everyone's a little different. But I do think improvement in management is definitely possible, right? Particularly if you take a somatic approach, because the past is not just in the past, isn't it? Right? The past, what we call the past, is right here. That's the thing with the body. Like I was saying earlier, body holds that memory. So all your past is playing out right now. So technically, in a sense, every time that past plays out, if you can catch it and provide something different that's new and therapeutic and contradicts the old experience, you can reprogram the body and nervous system gradually. And that's sort of the theory behind attachment healing work.
That's awesome. Yeah, that sounds really cool. And I know I've seen you speak before and do demonstrations to actually help people for things they can do themselves and empower themselves. So would you be able to give us a quick demonstration of how some of this might look in the body?
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
Let's do it. So let me start by priming the system for doing healing work. And I'll start with a real short guided meditation and a little bit of body release first. And then I'll take us into what a self-healing practice might look like. And usually you can do this by yourself, but it's also really powerful to have a partner say these things to you or hold this kind of quality or space. Sometimes we need to have someone else model it for us before we can really do it to ourselves. So the first thing I would do is, if you're sitting, come to the edge of your seat. If you're open to standing up, I would stand up. You want to bend the knees if you're standing, and just start to shake the body like this. Bring the arms to the sides, shake the arms out, and exhale through the mouth. And see if you can begin to release some of the tension or the stress in the body. And imagine extending that tension and pushing it out from the center towards the periphery. Okay. Once you shake your arms out a bit, lean forward slightly, shimmy your shoulders like this, alternating one shoulder forward at a time as you shake the arms if you can. And again, make the ha sound from the mouth. And repeat that a couple of times. Okay. Now, if you are standing, you can also bounce up and down. So you're just bending and straightening the knees like this. And you would just bounce up and down like this and let the pelvis and spine, everything move. And see if you can unlock the neck too and let go of the base of the skull. Unlock the jaw. And one of the reasons we do this is because when the body's in the protective mechanism state, right? And that's when the nervous system is also in a protective state. We can't really take in anything. And it's very difficult to shift. So it's often very helpful to work with the body first and see if you can, even if it's just a little bit, see if you can unlock some of the tension, because it'll open up more capacity for elasticity and shifting and change in the system. Okay. All right. Whew. Then pause, put your hands on your thighs, your knees, come forward on the sit bones and see if you can sit up tall like this. And when you do that, you want to take your pelvis and try to tilt it forward if you can. And the reason why we do this is because When the pelvis is tilted too far back, you'll collapse, right? And this is another way of closing off the system, right? To protect yourself. So if you can, tilt the pelvis forward just so slightly, as far as you can, and then create a little lift through the spine. And this will open up the organs, the abdomen, and the chest, and the shoulders should be able to drop back more naturally. After that, draw the chin back just a little so the neck is not compressed by jarring the chin forward, and create a little lift through the crown of the head. Tilt forward back on the front of your sit bones again, so you're not collapsing backwards. Drop the shoulders and take a long exhale. Now, once you can maintain that slight forward pelvic tilt and that upward elongation of the spine, begin to orient your body and your awareness to the ground. So you're going to feel your feet, you're going to feel your hips. And take a couple slow, natural breaths, long exhale, and begin to release some of that tension into the ground. Any tension you feel like you can let go of, release it into the earth. Then very gently and slightly extend your exhale. Push a little more air out on the out breath. And imagine that the chair and the ground are both holding you up, so you don't have to tense up and hold yourself up so much. Practice letting go a little bit and surrendering a little more in the body. And this takes trust. And again, creates more openness in the system. Okay, so just spend a couple more breaths here, lengthening exhale, orienting to the floor, to the ground. And we call this grounding. And it incites a state of calm and ease and stability in the body, and will help calm down the nervous system. All right. The next couple breaths, see if you can start breathing down a little lower into the belly, right into the core. So we're attempting to release the diaphragm. If I had more time, I would also do a little massage of the chest and the rib cage and the diaphragm just to release the abdomen and diaphragm so it's easier to breathe into the belly. But just do your best and breathe into the abdominal area, which will also stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system. A calm state. Okay, nice. And then place the awareness on the body and practice simply being present with the body. Now, if you notice, as I said earlier, if the body feels too uncomfortable, you can actually open the eyes, take the gaze out and look outward. So more of your awareness actually is out here, and just a little bit of your awareness is on the body. Okay. And depending on your comfort level, you can modulate that. Some people will feel more comfortable going inside, so you can close your eyes and really dip into your body more with your attention. So start where it's comfortable. Okay. So whether you're more distributed out here with your awareness or you're internal, be aware of the body for a couple more breaths. And the last thing, the simple thing I'm going to have you do is inwardly and very silently inside your mind, talk to your body and say, hi. And again, this is going to sound silly, but just try it. You're going to say, hi, I feel you, and I'm here with you. Again, hi, I'm here with you, and I am aware of you, body. And my attachment teacher says that the child self lives in the body. So imagine when you're talking to your body, you're talking to these younger parts of you that are still in your body from early childhood. And as you do that, notice to see if there are any sensations that become more active, like the chest might get a little tighter, maybe there's a little stir in the belly. Notice where the sensations show up as you say this in your mind. I feel you and I'm right here with you. And wherever you feel the sensation, place your hands in those areas. And you can repeat the same thing. I'm here with you and I feel you. You can even add, and I got you. Right? I'm right here with you and I got you. And all you need to do is just be present in a kind, gentle way. Think of how you might gently embrace a distressed baby or your dog or puppy, with that quality of gentleness and kindness, touching the areas where you feel sensation activating, breathing into those spots, gently holding them, being present with those areas, saying, hey, I feel you and I'm here and I got you. And what we're doing here is possibly meeting some connection need in areas of distress that are coming up in the body, aka child self. And using that sense of connection to help regulate the nervous system in the body and instill a sense of calm and security. Okay, so you can do this for as long as you like, but take a couple more breaths for the sake of this particular presentation. We're just going to take 2 more breaths. And then give it a little rub. Give the belly chest a little rub. And I want you to wrap around the waist and just give your lower back a little rub too. Breathe into your lower back. Good. And then rub your palms together. I'm going to do a little reset. So rub your face. And if you like, comb through the scalp. And then brush down from the chest. Shake the arms out. All right. So for the nervous system, we call the nervous system technically the autonomic nervous system, because the nervous system has various branches to it, and it also operates automatically in the body to regulate various functions, right? And this is one of the reasons why the nervous system is so important, because when the nervous system is really imbalanced or it's spiking too much in any one direction or getting stuck, it begins to really impact the healthy rhythm of your neurophysiology, the hormonal system, digestive system, etc. Right? So when we talk about the sympathetic nervous system, we're talking about the more activated state, right? When I get excited or when I'm feeling scared or in your fight or flight state, right? These are more engaged, activated states. So even when you're exercising or lifting or when you're playing, you're in a more, what we call a high tone or sympathetic state. Totally normal. Everyone should be modulating into those states. Problem becomes when we get stuck in those states perpetually because of trauma, right? So someone who's experienced a lot of disconnection, aloneness, or even traumatic experiences, people will get kind of stuck in that heightened state where they're always nervous or anxious, right? And you can imagine what that does to neurophysiology. When we're in a fight or flight state perpetually, we don't eliminate, digest very well, and the body doesn't restore or heal very well, right? And then the opposite, we have the parasympathetic state, which is the rest and digest state. And most of the times we say, oh, we want to be in parasympathetic, and it's true. So for example, doing something like abdominal breathing and bringing blood flow or breath into the belly will naturally physiologically stimulate the parasympathetic state and make you more relaxed. And this is a state where we're digesting, healing, resting, right? But the problem is when we have trauma, you can also have what we call a dorsal vagal response that becomes excessive. And this is a parasympathetic state connected to the vagus nerve branch. And what happens then is you turn into more of a shutdown mode person, right? The body goes into shutdown parasympathetic and gets stuck there. So this is what looks like depression, low motivation, right? Or when we get overwhelmed, we shut down. And then we get incapacitated. Another common place that shows up, particularly for men or for women, if you're arguing with your man or your partner and you're yelling at them, you're so upset, and they go, and they get really silent. And then they're like, I can't think straight, and they don't respond at all. That's usually what's happening, is they're actually going into what's called dorsal vagal, because maybe they don't want to fight. Maybe they had a childhood with their mother yelled at them a lot. So they go into hopeless and their whole system just goes docile and closes off. So it's a protection mechanism. So we want to be able to identify these different modulations in the nervous system and then have techniques that help us become more fluid in being able to flow in and out of them in a healthy way.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that demonstration, Mark. It's these really powerful practices, and you do such a beautiful job of guiding us through that. But also helping us understand the nervous system and how our body is really just this reflection of what's going on in our nervous system, and vice versa. Our nervous system is a reflection of what's going on in our body. And in a lot of ways, that starts to sometimes unconsciously impact our behavior or the way we're experiencing the world. So I love that you have these techniques and these patterns that help people access them in the body and also release them in the body. So for people who are watching or listening and really resonating with what you're talking about, or they loved that demo, how can they go deeper into this work? Where can they learn more, and just learn more from you?
You can find me on Instagram, Mark Tanaka Yoga. You can also find me on my website, marktanakayoga.com. I'll have some information posted on there. And I will be running some online courses in January as well around attachment healing and co-regulation of the nervous system. So you can look out for that. It should be on my website and social media. So.
Awesome. So people can find you online, and you have all kinds of offers around attachment and body movement, yoga, things like that. So given all of this stuff that we've talked about, because dove into a lot of really amazing concepts, what is one thing that you would like to leave us with today? What's the next step that our listeners can do to start making change in their life using some of these concepts?
Actually, I have to think about that one. Because I'm one of those people that overdoes it with too many things.
I know, I'm the same way.
Actually, the simplifying into one thing is like the most difficult thing, I think cultivating a relationship to yourself based in kindness is the most important thing. Really, really, and in a somatic way, right? When we say kindness, to me, I attribute it with warmth and gentleness and accepting quality, right? Acceptance. And I think cultivating that towards ourselves and learning how to share that with others, right? Receive that from others is so important. And to me, it's a really important ingredient in our well-being that we need to cultivate more. So I would say focus on that.
That is a really beautiful single tip. I know you have so much to share, but I do love that you left us with that idea of kindness, and especially kindness to yourself. Because I know a lot of us are so used to just being kind to everyone else, but this idea of walking away today and really focusing on kindness to yourself and your body is such a beautiful, singular thing to focus on if somebody was taking that away from this talk. Mark, thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom and showing us a beautiful practice that we can also do. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Sasha.
What a great session with Mark Tanaka. Thank you all for listening. We will see you soon.